Mandy Chapman Semple is Associate Director of the Corporation for Supportive Housing. And same question for you. What worked best and what were the results?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be in Seattle. So in 2012, Houston had a homeless population or at any point in time of around 8,600 individuals. Over half of those individuals were unsheltered. And I think that that's really important to note. And I think Houston was very fortunate to decide to get very serious in 2012 to begin tackling this issue, because had we waited, I think that population, given the tightness of the housing market today, would have only grown and grown and grown. And so it became very important for us at that moment to think about how to rapidly reduce the unsheltered population. Those were our individuals who are the most vulnerable. The shelter system was not an effective springboard for those individuals. And so it became clear that that's where our focus was. So much like Sam discussed, our intent in designing a system was all about how we target. And so we understood first and foremost that we were going to have to do things simultaneously, that we were going to have to figure out how to target the most vulnerable, the longest stayers in our community. We were going to have to find them where they were living on the streets. We were going to simultaneously create permanent housing options and build an infrastructure that could systematically move those folks from that outside camp into that housing as rapidly as possible. And that became our entire focus as a system. With that paradigm shift, it also allowed us to completely rethink how we organized ourselves as a system. And I think that was incredibly significant in order to get us off on the right foot. So while we had a collection of providers that were operating successfully and independently, none of those providers could themselves solve homelessness. And we needed to think of ourselves as a complete system. Each of those providers had to be working in tandem to achieve a particular result. And so as we started to think about how do we govern ourselves in a way that supports that, how do we make investments into our system in a way that supports that? And what we discovered is that it starts by actually defining what our shared goal is and defining what our shared measurement is. So it's no longer about what providers think is success, and it's about what we as a system believe is success. So at the end of the day in Houston, what we cared about the most was ending homelessness. And we knew to end homelessness, we had to put people in permanent housing, and we had to keep people in permanent housing. And if we did those things, and if those were the measures that we used as a system, everything else would fall in line. It also meant that that became the organizing principles for how we were going to both govern ourselves and implement and operate. Every day we were going to be putting people into permanent housing, and we were going to be monitoring whether they came back. And we were going to continue to build a system that functioned as a safety net to ensure that they didn't fall back into homelessness. And over time, we were able to just systematically scale. And so I think the important lessons learned is that we started by targeting our most vulnerable, outside on the streets. We devoted all of our energy and resources to scooping those folks up and moving them systematically into permanent housing. We brought our partners to the table, like the Housing Authority, like the city, like the county, and we didn't ask them to run our programs, right? We asked them to contribute resources, to align their activities and be part of a broader oversight body that was comprised of both the philanthropic community, the public funding community, and the business community. And I think that was really critical because it allowed us to maintain a clear focus on the shared responsibility and the shared measure and not anyone's individual pressures or interests. And so what that meant is very systematically, everyone's activities then started to line up. And I think the best example that I can offer is we no longer have case managers in Houston. I know it sounds crazy, but the problem with a case manager in the homeless response system is what are you case managing to? We needed to transform every one of those human resources into a very particular activity, right? All providers working in tandem. So now we have assessors, we have housing navigators, we have permanent supportive housing case managers, we have rapid rehousing case managers, and we have outreach workers. We don't have anybody floating in the middle that just has a case of homeless individuals, a caseload of homeless individuals, case managing them through a system, right? And that's just an example of that intentionality that we were able to bring to the system organization and how we were able to help providers find their niche, right? Not every organization has every one of those positions. And some organizations were able to let go of doing all of those activities so that they could focus on the one or two things they do really well in our system, and we began to rely on them heavily to perform those tasks on behalf of the entire system, not just the clients that happen to walk through their door. So it's through all of that kind of intentionality and organization as a system that we've been able to take our unsheltered homeless population from 4,500 in 2011 to 1,100 in 2016.
So Mandy, just quickly, the organizations that could not adapt to this new system, what happened to them?
Well, so I think that everyone gets very fearful. This is a very common question, but here's the reality. You don't go 0 to 100 overnight. And so we started with the providers that were interested in making that paradigm shift. We had very clear leadership and very clear governance at the top that said, we are going to begin to do this work, but we are going to use phased implementation. And what phased implementation means is, this month, we're going to assemble a team of providers who are interested in volunteering to try out these new roles, and we're going to house 25 people in this month, beginning to end. And we're going to do it all manually. There was no fancy electronic system at that moment. Everyone was running around figuring things out. We were doing it on paper, but the commitment was we're going to do 25, and then we're going to learn lessons, and that's going to inform the policy that we create that will eventually allow us to go to scale. So what we didn't do is go into a room and try to conceive all of the different systems and policies and how all the technology was going to work and how everything was going to happen, and then try to overlay it and then freak everybody out because a lot of people feel left out. What we did is we started to kind of grow it organically, and then very rapidly we went to scale. But our providers were the ones sitting at the table helping us figure it out and helping inform those policies. And I'm a big fan of understanding the difference between governance infrastructure and implementation infrastructure. And I think it's really critical to know that governance is where policies are approved, and implementation infrastructures are where policies are created and tested and refined, and they should be used as a tool, as a vehicle to build a system, not as a tool to force change.
So
right,
the organizations essentially adapted themselves, is that what you're saying?
They adapted themselves over time. And what happened is as we became more successful and more skilled as a system in knowing how to come together, there was a bigger call to action among our provider community to fall into these new roles. Our funders started to line up their RFPs and their funding cycles to support those roles and nothing else. And I would say that 80% of the providers came along with us voluntarily at the pace that worked for them. We incentivized their participation along the way. So I remember early on when we wanted more and more folks to put their units into our coordinated entry system, we offered bonus points in the scoring process, right? So we tried to incentivize before we ever mandated. And by the time we were mandating, almost everyone was doing it, and it really made a difference. Over time, more and more of those individuals who struggled to find their place, either because the private funding community has asked them to become a part of the system, or they've been able to define themselves as a boutique program that really exists for the outliers. But because we're such a data-driven system, it's really easy to prove that up or not, right?
All right, thank you. Phil Ansell. Phil Ansell is director of the LA County Homeless Initiative. And LA County, how many people are in LA County?
About 10 million.
10 million people. So what worked for you?
So good morning, everyone. Happy to be here. The Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors launched the Los Angeles County Homeless Initiative on August 17, 2015, 19 months ago. And at that time, there was a pervasive sense of despair across Los Angeles County around our ability to actually be effective in combating homelessness. Despite many years of high-quality work that had been done, there was nonetheless a pervasive sense of despair. And 2 weeks ago, Los Angeles County voters demonstrated that pervasive sense of despair had transformed itself into a widespread sense of hope. When 69% of Los Angeles County voters in an off-year election with a conservative electorate approved a countywide 1/4 cent sales tax dedicated to combating homelessness over the next 10 years, generating $355 million annually, primarily for rental subsidies and services. So I want to spend these few minutes talking about how pervasive despair became widespread hope in 19 months. We set out to develop a coordinated set of strategies to bring to our Board of Supervisors for approval that would address the full range of homeless populations. And I should say that as of January 2016, we had 47,000 people experiencing homelessness based on our point-in-time count, 70% of whom are unsheltered, and an estimate of over 150,000 people who experience homelessness over the course of a year. So we set out to develop a coordinated set of strategies to address the full range of homeless populations: chronically homeless adults, families, veterans, youth, and other homeless single adults. Our process was guided by two fundamental principles. One, no entity in Los Angeles County can solve homelessness alone. It's a uniquely complex problem that requires participation by the county, our 88 cities, that's 88 cities, the homeless service provider community, business, and the faith community. And secondly, and very importantly, mainstream governmental service delivery systems, most of which are part of Los Angeles County government, have a fundamental role to play in combating homelessness. That's health services, social services, and criminal justice. So we embarked on a process based on those premises. 18 policy summits on 9 topics over a 9-week period. 400 different invited individuals from across those sectors participated. And the key about the success of that process, which is the foundation of this transformation from despair to hope, is listening. I ran those summits myself, and I told the participants the most important word for the success of this process is listening. Deep listening to each other. We come with different experience, different perspectives, in some cases different priorities, but by listening to each other, we can collectively discern the best path forward. When we began that process, there wasn't a single person in Los Angeles County who knew what those strategies would be, and there's not a single person who could have constructed those strategies on their own. It was through this process of deep listening that these strategies emerged. 47 draft strategies released for public comment in January, 500 people at a community-wide meeting to hear about and comment, 200 organizations submitted written comments on the draft strategies, and ultimately, on February 9, 2016, our Board of Supervisors unanimously adopted 47 strategies across 6 categories with public testimony from elected officials from 20 of the cities in the county and dozens of service providers, 100% unanimous in urging the board to adopt the strategies and $100 million in one-time funding to launch their initial implementation while we pursued an ongoing funding source, which culminated in the approval 2 weeks ago of the 1/4 cent dedicated sales tax. The room on February 9th, 2016 was filled with portraits of homeless adults created by Stuart Perlman, a psychiatrist and professional artist. And significantly, after that board meeting, the county treasurer, not someone who's typically very involved in homelessness, said to me, "The board hearing room has never felt like that before." I had never even heard anyone talk about what the board hearing room felt like. Never mind distinguish one day from another. The board hearing room had never felt like that before. That exemplified what was happening in Los Angeles County as people were coming together and aligning in a deep way that had not happened before. Fast forward to March 31st, the county convened the first ever Mayor's Regional Summit to combat homelessness. Brought together elected officials and managers from 55 of the 88 cities in the county who are collectively home to 95% of the countywide homeless population. Fast forward again to February 8th, 2017, where the county hosted the first annual Homeless Initiative Conference. Brought together 500 people from across these sectors in a full-day conference to look back at our first year of experience with trying to implement these strategies and look forward to the challenges ahead. All 5 members of our elected Board of Supervisors voluntarily came and spoke. They each invited a mayor from their districts who came and spoke. And the mayor of the city of Los Angeles, our largest city, home to 40% of the countywide population and 60% of the countywide homeless population, came and spoke. People said, coming out of that conference, that they felt like they were part of a movement to combat homelessness. It's not often that government is in a leadership role of something that feels like a social movement to the people participating in it. And that term, we feel like we're part of a movement, for me encapsulates a lot of what has actually happened in Los Angeles County over this period of time. What does a movement look like? Shared vision, shared purpose, high level of trust, egolessness, lack of territoriality, innovation, flexibility, creativity, passion. All of those words characterize what is happening today in Los Angeles County as we combat homelessness. As I mentioned, on March 7th, Los Angeles County voters approved this quarter-cent sales tax. And tomorrow morning, I'll be chairing the first meeting of a group of 50 stakeholders from across these sectors, appointed by the Board of Supervisors, who over the next 7 weeks will develop specific recommendations to the Board of Supervisors around the utilization of the sales tax revenue across 21 strategies specified by the Board of Supervisors. 17 of our current 41 strategies that need ongoing funding, and 4 new strategies that we couldn't implement with the one-time funding. And it's my goal to forge a consensus with those 50 people about how to spend $1 billion over the next 3 years. And I'm optimistic that in the 12 hours we have together in 4 3-hour meetings, that we'll be able to get to a consensus because of the level of alignment and the degree of shared emergence that's happening across our system. I want to close with 2 comments. First, Mandy used the word organic, and I just want to echo that in terms of our experience. This feels a lot less like an architect designing a building in a blueprint and then building it, and a lot more like being a parent, which I am, as I'm sure are many of you, where my job as a parent has been to nurture my children to become that which they are intended to be without fully knowing in advance what that is as they emerge into now young adulthood. And it feels the same nurturing this process of collective alignment and emergence. And then finally, I'd like to share a quote from the Buddha, where the Buddha said that a single candle can light 1,000 others without diminishing itself. And it feels in Los Angeles County like there's a lot of us who are lighting each other's candles. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. So it's time for questions now. If you have a question, we have people with microphones. Raise your hand, and while we're waiting for the first one, I just want to ask, what's your timeline? You're just getting started now. You've got the money. What's the timeline?
So the board approved our strategies February 9, 2016. Over half of them are already implemented. The remainder will be implemented by July of this year. Our timeline is to have board approval on June 13th. We expect to begin collecting the tax on July 1st. and we will immediately move toward amending existing contracts, many of which are held by our Department of Health Services or our continuum of care organization known as the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority. So within the first quarter of beginning to collect the tax, we will start utilizing the funds primarily to expand existing services and programs. We are not starting from scratch. We have the car. What we need is more gas to make the car go. And I should say that we estimate that over the first 5 years of this quarter-cent sales tax, we will enable 45,000 homeless families and adults to exit homelessness into permanent housing, and an additional 30,000 families and adults to avoid becoming homeless.
All right.